Hello and welcome to the lesson where we're going to be walking you through DDL, or what is also known as Data Definition Language. Now, SQL actually has three specific languages that you can use. One is DDL, which basically defines things like databases and procedures. It's the basic syntax that we use to create things in the database. The other will be DML, which allows us to manipulate the data manipulation language. And that's where we're going to use things like insert and update and delete the data, and that's specific to the data. The other one that we'll cover later on is DCL, which is data control language. That's how we set controls around who can access that, which is basically security. So right now we're focused on how do we make tables and things inside the database. And as we create a database, there's a lot of things and a lot of components you can put into a database, and there's a lot of configuration you can put into that as well. So there's a lot to bite into, I guess, when you start to code with DDL. And please don't be overwhelmed by that. What I am going to give you later on is a matrix that helps you kind of actually make sense of this massive chapter, so that you can kind of go through this and go, okay, I want to create a table. How do I do that? Or, oh, I want to edit this table. How do I do that? And I think that that will help you kind of make sense of the reading. So if you've just gone through the reading and you're just overwhelmed, don't worry. It's totally fine. We're going to get you there. But every time we're doing SQL, you're expected to kind of go through and do the reading, look at the examples from the reading, and actually run those examples as well. We'll give you that code, and that will help people who learn better by doing. And I think SQL is a language that you learn by doing and not just by reading. And so you would want to read and do at the same time. So as we're talking through this right now, I'm going to show you syntax, but I think it's not really going to stick until you actually do it. And even if I show you examples, it's not going to stick until you actually go run those examples. What this matrix basically lays out for you is all the different types of components that you can interact with in a database. So for example, there are tables. Tables have columns. Columns have data types. You can actually then specify a constraint on the column, and you can actually specify a constraint on the table itself. And we'll walk through kind of what these are. And anytime you're doing something to one of these objects, there's basically three things you can do. You can create the object, so you can create the table. I can edit the table, and I can delete the table. So now that you know that, right, if you kind of are approaching this assignment and you're sitting or practice and you're thinking, all right, Clint has asked me to, take this table and rename it. How do I do that? Well, this is the matrix that I would refer to get started. Over time, though, this syntax is going to be kind of plugged into your memory, and you're going to actually know how to do this stuff from memory. But when you're starting out, this is the thing that I would go to. So for example, if I create a table, to do that, you simply just go here, look to the matrix and say, okay, I want to create a table. And here you go. It says you can create a table using the create table command. Go to page 315. Examples 1, 2, and 3 are examples on how to do this. So not only do I point you where in the book, but I tell you the examples to go look at as well. For example, if I want to then edit that table, okay, how do I do that? So I want to edit the table. So it says here, you have to use the alter table command to make edits to table columns, data types, and constraints. Go to page 223. All the examples on that page are examples of how you go about editing, whether I want to edit the column, I want to edit the data type, I want to edit the constraints. So, same thing here. If I want to, let's say I want to modify a data type. I want to modify it. You can modify the column's data type when you alter the table. And again, on page 223, example 4 shows you how to do that. So I hope that you appreciate this, and I hope you use this. I'm a consultant by trade, so I love frameworks, and I love matrices, and I love being able to quickly solve problems by getting my thoughts in order. And I think that will help you. I'm going to actually pull up the code that you'll recognize from the book, and I'm going to go in here and just start to remind you, like if I hit Control Enter here on a PC, it will go and run this statement, and that's because it has a semicolon here, so it knows to run and stop here. You'll notice here that I got this error message, and you're going to get familiar with this error message because there will be times where you create tables and you forget you created them, and now you try to create another table, and it doesn't overwrite. That's something a lot of people think, oh, why doesn't it just overwrite the table? It doesn't. If you want to create a table with the same name, the first thing you have to do is you have to go drop that table and you have to recreate it. Now, if I show you really quickly here, I'm actually going to try to drop this table, and it's going to give me this constraint error, and that's because there are child tables, right? The vendors can have many invoices, and invoices can have invoice lines, and I haven't deleted those invoice or invoice line tables. And so, honestly, the best thing here to do is I'm going to just go and drop everything, and I'm going to give you access to a script that looks like this. It's simple, and it's just going to go drop all of the sequences and tables and common tables and sequences that we're going to use. And again, if I run this as a statement, it's only going to run that one statement. And I don't want to run each statement one at a time. That is going to take too long. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go and run everything. And we're just going to drop everything. So it's dropping, 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 dropping. It's going to get rid of everything there. Now, there are a couple errors in here that you saw. If you get error messages, I strongly want to urge you to go and look at why that error message occurred. In this scenario here, it says, hey, this sequence doesn't exist. And that makes sense. I actually went and dropped this sequence here, and then I dropped this sequence. And then when I ran this whole thing, it gave me here and it said, hey, that sequence doesn't exist. So look at the error messages and do not ignore them. You'll notice here it says, drop order table orders. Table does not exist. Fine, so there's no table called orders. Now if I go back, one tip here is if you go back here and you refresh, if you don't see it refresh, what I highly recommend is close everything and refresh it and then open it back up. You'll notice here I've got this table called hash table, just ignore that. It's something else I'm playing with here. So now I have basically no tables here that are gonna conflict with what I'm gonna do. In fact, if we wanna just get rid of hash table, let's just get rid of it. Hash table, let's just drop it. Refresh. All right, now we got nothing here. So we're gonna start from scratch, and I recommend as you practice this to do the same. So if I go through and actually run the create table statement, you'll see here that it says the table was created, and now there it is. And it has no data in it because we haven't put any data in it yet. If I want to drop the table, simply just go drop table, it drops it. If I want to recreate it, I can go recreate it. So I'm gonna run this drop table statement again, because if I go back and try to recreate these tables over and over again, you're gonna get this error that says, hey, this table already exists. So as you progress through this and practice this, you'll see that this creates the table, but now we have constraints. So if I run this, it will create the table. There it goes. And by the way, if you're wondering why it took 4 seconds for that to happen, remember what's happening here is that we're using my client machine, and I'm communicating with the server somewhere, and actually I'll tell you specifically, it's in a server center or a data center across 35 from me, across from the stadium. There's a big computing resources building over there, and it's just a big old building filled with a bunch of computers called servers. So what's happening is my computer is connecting to that server, and it's sending this statement to it. And maybe for some reason there was a little bit of a slowdown in my connection on the internet. Maybe there was a kind of a clog in the the inner tubes of the internet. I'm totally dumbing it down, but something happened, and my statement went there. It took a while. It finally ran, and the response came back. So sometimes that happens. So I'm going to go and create these other tables, right? And as we go through and create them, you'll see that if we want to add columns, we have to make sure that they are separated by commas. One common error that I see a lot of students do is as they get in here and they start writing in their columns, and then as they add in this extra comma or something like that, if they try to run this, they're going to get this error message. One thing to watch for is when you see this pink outline, that is a flagging that, hey, I see something. It's kind of like a spell check, if you will. And if I see that, then I know that some error has potentially, or some issue has occurred, and this should be the thing that draws your attention to things like forgetting about the, removing that extra comma, or maybe you actually left out the commas. Like here, you'll see here, there's some issue here. And actually the problem is that it's expecting that this comma, there should be a comma between these two columns. And so again, that's what you should be looking for as you run this code. Now, if we want to code a primary key, simply all we have to do is go in and run it. So what we're doing is just adding in this identifier here at the column level and saying, hey, this is a primary key. Now you may wonder, do I need to, does it matter if I add one space, or do I need to tab it, or any of that stuff? It really doesn't actually matter. Great thing about SQL is that it does not care about white space, meaning this space between the different text in the code. I showed you in the lecture where you could create the primary key. You could do that at a table, at a column level, which is what we're doing here. You can also create that constraint at a table level. And so the difference here is that instead of actually going up here and typing in this is the primary key and doing it like this, what we're going to do is we're going to actually define the primary key down here. And so we're just identifying, again, the required fields, the columns, the data types, and then we've added in that this constraint called the vendor underscore PK is a primary key, and it refers to this column. Now, if I'm ever using a single column primary key, I tend to not do it here because this is, to me, a lot harder to write and harder to read than just going here and doing it at the column level. So I like it that way. And that works just fine. The other thing is that as I go in here, though, and I want to define a primary key with 2 columns, we already know that we cannot do that at a table level. So if I tried to do it, this is something students in my class will always do this with me. They'll say, hey, Clint, can you do this in SQL? And I would say probably 50% of the time, I don't know the answer. And the only way I learn is that I just go figure it out. I just, go try it. So in this case, I'm like, well, can you define the primary key at, a dual primary key or a 2 column composite key? Can you define it at a column level like this? So let's just run it and see what happens. And it gives you this ugly error, and it says table can only have 1 primary key, so remove the extra primary key. Now we know that you can have 2 primary keys. We know that a column can have a single primary key, but we know we can have 2 columns be part of it. So again, what we'll do here is if I define it now at the table level, and I go in and I say, okay, this is a constraint. The name of that constraint is line items PK. It's a primary key, but instead of being 1 column, it's 2 columns. So if I run this, it creates the table just fine. So what gets confused here is that SQL thinks you're trying to create 2 primary keys on the table. And you're really not. You're creating 1 primary key, but out of 2 columns. So that's why at a table level, you have to define composite primary keys. But if it's 1 single primary key, like an employee ID, I tend to do it in the column level. It's all fine and good, and we're not going to make you pick one over the other. But I would say, pick the one that you're comfortable with and pick the one that's easier to write, pick the one that's easier to read. So now how do I go and add foreign keys? So I'm gonna go drop these tables. So we know that vendors can have invoices. So that means that a vendor should connect to the invoices table. So let's go create the vendor and invoice table. Now you can do that by simply saying, all right, let's create the vendor table. But the invoice table, we're going to say here, this is the foreign key, and it's going to refer back to this table, the vendor table. So we're going to say the vendor ID is a number, and it references vendors table, and this is the column that it references. So if you're thinking, well, how do I know that? In the book, it will show you that when you were referring to a foreign key, you have to identify it in this structure. You have to say it references, and then you have to say the name of the table, and then in parentheses, the name of the column. So that's exactly what it shows you here that it's doing. So if I want, actually just go run this as a script, meaning it'll go boom, boom, and it'll create both of those at the same time. Now, the other option you have is that you can create a actual foreign key at the table level. So this code right here, where it says the vendors is, there's a constraint called invoices foreign key vendors. It's a foreign key constraint. It is on the vendor ID column, and it references the vendor table and specifically the vendor ID on that vendor table. Now, I think this is where some people will say, look, that to me is harder to write than this. This is much more intuitive. And I'm never going to specifically say you have to do it one way or the other in maybe an exam or a quiz. In fact, in real life, you do it however it works best for you. So if I want, I can get rid of this version, and I'm just going to go and create them both. And now I've got both the tables. And let's try doing something right here. Let's try inserting an invoice into the invoices table. Now, what will happen here? Can we have an invoice without a vendor? So the vendor has invoices. So the vendor is the parent, the invoice is the child. So can I have an invoice without a vendor? You know, or think about an example of a student. Can we have a student enrolled in a class that doesn't exist? Doesn't work, right? So let's run this command here and say insert into invoices, and we're going to run it, and it's going to give us this error, and it's going to say, hey, there's an integrity constraint. This invoice vendor, this invoices foreign key vendors was violated, and meaning, hey, no parent key was found. That's simply saying, hey, I didn't find the vendor ID that you just tried to insert a invoice for. So that's how we know that the foreign key will work. So quickly to walk you through some of the other examples in the book, if I go and delete this invoice table and I recreate it with this check constraint, again, you can add a check constraint at a column level. And unlike the primary key, you can put multiple check constraints on multiple columns. So I can go in here also and I can add in multiple constraints for a single column. So I can, add in it be not null, I can make it unique, I can say it's, default, I can do all these kinds of constraints. So in this case, we're just gonna actually set these check constraints. And what will happen here is if a record gets inserted into this table, it's going to, the table constraint here is gonna check, hey, if somebody tries to insert an invoice total that is not greater than 0, it's gonna throw an error message. So that's what the check is doing. It's saying, it's telling us what has to be true. The invoice total has to be greater than 0. And again, if I try to go in and insert a invoice, it's going to say, you're not allowed to do that. Let's make sure we have a vendor table created too. Yeah, the check constraint is violated, meaning, hey, you're not allowed to do that. Now let's just review really quickly that you can also define the check constraints not only at a column level, but if you want, you can do it at a table level. I'd like to do check constraints at the table level if they get really complex. So you can actually do the exact same thing here in this code. You'll see that this statement here puts a check constraint on both the invoice total and the payment total, so these have to be greater than 0. You can also use this AND operator and just say, hey, we have a constraint, it's a check constraint. And you'll notice, by the way, that the constraints at the table level always follow the same structure. It's the constraint, the name of the constraint, the type of the constraint. So you could say it's constraint, name, and it's primary key, or it's a foreign key, or it's a check constraint. But the check constraint, then you have to then specify what the rules are. So we actually, in some ways, can write this on one line versus having to write it across 2. And again, that prevents us from entering in something that violates that constraint, like a negative invoice amount. As we go through and use the alter syntax, again, you can go in here and we can create a table like vendors, but let's say I want to go in and now I want to add a column to vendors. Now, there's one option here, right? One option is you could just drop the table and I could go add that column in and say last transaction date, and it's a date. And just to be modeling good behavior, I'm going to space my code out so it's nice and pretty and easy to read. And I can go do that. I can create this table, do it that way. The other option is that maybe you don't want to have to recreate, drop the table and recreate it. So we can try this one more time. We can, what SQL allows you to do is you can go create this table. And then maybe you say, oh, you know what, I wanted to add a column to the table. So to do that, the matrix will tell you that if I want to edit a table and I want to add a column, I would have to go alter the table and I have to add a column. So here you'll see you can alter the table, and then when you alter that table, you can add, you can drop, you can modify certain things on it. So here we can alter the table and we can add that column. And now if I go and refresh and see, you'll see that it has the last transaction date actually accessible on it. You can also, let's say I want to drop that column. So I want to, but I want to keep the table. I don't want to drop the table. So I can go run that. So I'll just hit Control Enter. It's taking a while to get across 35. There we go. It altered the table. So I'll just refresh this again. And look, now that column is gone. And maybe that's helpful. I'm probably skipping over that right now, but maybe that's helpful is as you're doing DDL to go over here and refresh the left panel and actually look at what's happening. And maybe I want to change this, like right now when I look at this vendor name is a varchar of 50. But maybe I want to allow vendor names to be 100. So I could go alter the table, modify the vendor name, and I'm not changing the name of that column, I'm just changing this data type. Again, if I refresh this, let's refresh here. Ah, there we go. And sure enough, now it's varchar 100, meaning I can put up to 100 characters in it. And you can, anything you can basically think of, you can do. If you can logically think it, you could probably do it with the code. So there's a lot of things you can do in here, right? I could modify the, vendor's name. I could add in a constraint. I could add a default constraint. And so, if I wanted to go in here and say I want to add a default name of, new vendor, I could go in here and insert a vendor. And let's go look at the data on that table. And sure enough, there's the US Postal Service. I could also just go in here. If I don't specify the name, just go enter vendor 2. Let's see. Go back here and refresh. Oh, look, it gave me the default. And so, yeah. So if we want to alter things on the table, you use the alter table statement. And the last thing is, you can also alter constraints. And I think I'm not probably going to go through all of these examples, but let me just show you some of the syntax. Again, if I go back here and I just want to refresh this, I'm going to go drop my invoice and vendors table. If I want to, let's say I create these tables and then later on I want to add constraints in here. Let's say I want to drop this invoice check constraint. I don't want the table to have that constraint. Again, if I want to do that, you just say I want to alter this table and I want to drop the constraint. And so all of these examples from the book you can go through and run and just play around and see what they're doing, right? I can go in and run this statement, and what that now will do is I should be able to go in and I should be able to enter an invoice that has a negative invoice total. And because now I've gotten rid of that constraint. And if you want to know, like, how do I see that? Again, let's add the constraint back in. Let's go look at the vendor invoice table. And here you'll see the constraints under the constraints tab. You'll see, oh, we have these constraints, these check constraints. I could go in here and I could say I want to alter the table and I want to drop that constraint. Now when I go back and refresh, the invoice total check is going to disappear. And but I still have a payment total constraint on there. And so if I try to enter a negative payment total, it won't be allowed. The enable disable, it's just basically if I wanted to not drop the constraint, but I want to disable that constraint, all that's allowing me to do is I could even create it in a disabled fashion. This typically is happening when you're, moving lots of, data around in tables and the constraints are slowing you down, but we want to just turn them off temporarily. So you can kind of toggle them on and off. So that's where you could enable or disable a constraint. I think for practicing purposes, I'm not going to make you do that. So as we progress through this, all of the code here, we're going to give it to you. The last one I just want to show you is like if I wanted to go and rename, let's say vendors in the vendor table to vendors, you could do that with a rename command. I could also, do the same thing with, let's change invoices to table invoice, something really like, a little bit easier to read. So again, if I refresh this, if you need to collapse it, there it is, right? You see that it's there and it's been changed. If I want to delete everything out of the table, you would just run a truncate command. And I got an error here because I didn't have that table created, but the vendor truncate command would actually just delete everything that's in there. We've already run the drop commands multiple times where you will drop the table for you. And so yeah, that's everything from the chapter. That's a lot, but that kind of gives you kind of a hands-on experience of knowing how to run the code and see what I'm doing as I'm walking through the code. You'll see as I'm playing around with it, you'll see that maybe I'll try things, or I'll get an error, and what do I do with that? Or I see this little pink squiggle line. What do I do with that pink squiggle to fix the errors? So hopefully this will start getting you more familiar with how we're going to get used to using this tool a lot. And anyway, we hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, let us know, and we look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.